Good afternoon, everybody. Project manager for hazardous materials. This afternoon I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about what we're doing with hazardous materials, where we are in the project, what we've already produced, but most importantly, as Nick alluded to, some changes that are coming to how we structure hazardous materials guidance. Changes that you need to know because they may well, or they're very likely to impact on your policies and procedures and the training that you implement. So you've seen the framework a number of times in Nick's presentation. So we are talking about hazardous materials here. The Hazardous Materials project was kicked off last year, headed up by Dave Walton, CFO lead for hazmats. And we started looking at what guidance was already out there. There's a significant piece, you may well be aware, the DCLG guidance for hazmats was produced in 2012. A very large piece of guidance, fondly known in the team as the BRIC. Very comprehensive, lots of guidance, lots of information. But services were kind of reporting back that they were finding that a bit unwieldy, a bit difficult to use. And so the aim of our project was really to break that down into its component parts and make that more user-friendly. So we used the tiering of the framework to divide that up into a more useful framework. So we have Tier 1 guidance here. That covers all the generic hazards, so any hazards that would be common to any hazmat incident. And then we have Tier 2. So as you may have already noticed, this is different to the framework that Nick showed earlier. But originally we were proposing 9 pieces of guidance that would reflect the 9 transport classifications. And then in Tier 3 we have specialist operational response. So SOR, specialist operational response, CBRNE, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear and explosives. I'm only going to say that once. And IOR, initial operational response. Obviously that piece of work has already been done. It was done earlier in the programme because there was a need to get that piece of guidance out early. So firstly we were looking at the Tier 1, the generic piece covering hazardous materials. So we drew a team together of experts from across the country. We peer-reviewed that guidance with other fire rescue services, other agencies such as the EA, Public Health, and then it went out for consultation at the end of last year, and we published that in April this year. And hopefully some of you may have well had a chance to see that. If you have feedback, then we're always, as Nick said, we're always keen to hear your views on it. So that piece of work is done now. The headlines for that, what's new and noteworthy. Initial operational response, as I've already said, that piece of guidance has been produced. It has its own dedicated piece of guidance. But the team felt very strongly that the principles of an initial operational response, so being able to put into place some immediate actions, some immediate safe systems of work so that you can take that very immediate action, was actually applicable to any hazmat incident where that might be the case, regardless of whether there's malicious intent or not. So we drew in those principles to the generic piece of guidance, so it covers all those safe systems of work that you need to perhaps implement life-saving activity and meanwhile keeping your firefighters safe. So that is in there already. Now the very specific stuff that's absolutely about CBRNE and that activity remains in that dedicated document, and there'll be a review of that document in the future. Dry decontamination was a new element of initial operational response. There was some confusion about how that should be applied when it initially sort of came forward. So this piece of guidance discusses that and clarifies that. Mass decontamination, there's a bit of change, a bit of flux in that particular area. The national assets, some of them have been reduced. There's a bit of uncertainty about what the picture will look like in the future. So the guidance we've produced talks about mass decontamination as an element of operational response rather than talking about them as national assets. So it's something that you would need to provide for, and how you go about doing that is down to your services. So hopefully that approach allows a bit of flexibility in how you write your policies and procedures. And lastly, it reflects the latest GHS doctrine. So it talks about a joint understanding of risk rather than the original joint dynamic hazard assessment, and all the more recent changes have been incorporated into that. So it's bang up to date there. So that's Tier 1, published in April, all done, dusted, but let us have your feedback, obviously. Tier 2, this is what the message that I really want to get home today is more about Tier 2. So when we came to this, look at this project earlier in the year, the proposal was to produce 9 pieces of guidance. So that's a piece of guidance for every one of the 9 transport classifications. But between the team, we felt actually that would mean quite a significant amount of duplication, because a lot of the hazards and controls are going to be similar across those 9 classifications. So you can imagine for flammable liquids, flammable solids, gases, you're often going to have the same hazards. They're going to catch fire, they're going to explode perhaps, and the controls are going to be similar. So we were looking for perhaps a solution to that, and it was actually the National Chemical and Emergency Centre, who are represented on the project team, who came forward and suggested that perhaps we might consider UN GHS, which is the UN globally harmonised system for the classification and labelling of chemicals. Now, some of you may be familiar with that, some of you may well not be, I can imagine, but it is basically, UN GHS is a piece of guidance that recommends to all the UN countries what their legislation should say. So it's a way, the purpose behind it is to get consistency across the UN countries of how chemicals and hazardous materials are classified and how they are communicated. It is actually the overarching guidance. So when we look at our regulations, we have supply regulations and CLP and the 9 transport classifications of dangerous goods and the reflected legislation that sits underneath those. And as you can see from this diagram, there's a whole arm there that we are really just ignoring by only looking at the 9 classes. So by taking GHS, we're taking the parent document, we're taking the overarching piece of guidance, and by doing that we then look at a broader spectrum of hazards. So we pick up all of the hazards that would be in the supply regulation, that would be in the supply regulations. And a lot of those hazards that we aren't currently considering at the moment are hazards to health, so often with longer term effects. So they will now be encompassed if we use GHS as our structure. So I will move on. So one of the other real benefits of using GHS is it has this top tier structure to categorise its hazards. So we have physical hazards, health hazards, and environmental hazards. Physical hazards are those that release energy. So I'm not going to get any more scientific than that, but they are ones that basically cause an explosion, catch fire, things like that. And you can imagine the control measures that you would implement would be very similar. They would be things like cordons, cooling, preventing ignition. Health hazards, fairly self-explanatory hopefully, but they're things that are going to poison you, burn or corrode your skin. And again, the control measures for those would be quite similar in that they'd be PPE, decontamination, containment. Environmental hazards, you'll see it's green, and that is because we have already produced the piece of guidance environmental protection, which you may remember seeing in the framework. So that piece of work has already been done, so we aren't going to look at that in detail, we will just do a gap analysis to make sure that everything's covered there. So it's this top structure that we intend to use for our guidance, and hopefully I've explained some of the benefits there, but just to summarise, it really simplifies the approach to dealing with hazardous materials. So, and hopefully you can pass on that simplification in your policies and procedures. So instead of, for your incident commander, having sort of 9 policies and procedures rattling around in their heads, they've now just got to think of 2 things. Is this going to explode? Is it going to catch fire? Or is it going to hurt me or my firefighters? So it really does simplify the approach, and hopefully in simplifying it, if it's easier, we can do it better, can't we? As I said, it deals with more hazards that we aren't currently looking at, so there'll be all those hazards to health that will now be brought in, and we'll be doing a more comprehensive job. As I say, reduces repetition, and it future-proofs. This change is coming. That GHS guidance, I don't know whether you noticed, but that's the 5th edition, so it's not actually something that's that new. We've been commended for being ahead of the curve with this particular project, but in reality it has been around quite a long time. It's something that you would need to start looking at as your services. It's becoming more and more embedded in legislation, so it's coming. Let's do it now. And then we'll be in a really good position moving forwards. So in that simplification, what we don't want to ignore is the fact that actually dealing with hazmats is a very technical thing. There's lots of technical information, there's lots of knowledge and understanding that we don't want to lose, but we do want to keep the guidance really streamlined. So what we intend to do is produce a piece of foundation material that will cover GHS, and all that technical information, all that knowledge and understanding can then sit in that separate document, keeping the guidance nice and streamlined. And the guidance will refer across to the foundation, but it's kept separately. So we think that setup, that suite of documents, is really the most user-friendly way we can present that guidance to you. So let's just have a look at how that fits in the framework. There it is. And as I said, environmental hazards has been covered in environmental protection, so that's there. So we're just looking at those 2 pieces of guidance in Tier 2. So we do realise that this is a significant change for hazmat guidance, and it's going to cause you some things that you're going to want to think about in implementation. So we're doing a lot of communication, we've done a lot of engagement. We'll be creating another little video to explain the change, explain a little bit about GHS. We'll also be running some road shows later on in the year. In fact, I think I've got later on in the year, autumn. We'll be doing peer review in probably around December. So if you're interested, if you know of anybody that would be interested in being involved with that, then come and speak to us. Consultation springtime next year, and then we're aiming to publish this in August 2017. So if you have any questions, jot them down, and I'll be happy to take any questions on this during the plenary.